Paddock Mall Studios, this is WOCA, Ocala, Gainesville, The Villages, 1370 AM, 96.3 FM, The Source.
All right, it's not the kind of bumper music I would have picked normally when we're going to talk about the 50th anniversary of the lunar landing, the first time we had human beings on the moon. But this music, apparently, according to the news this morning, was the music that Neil Armstrong picked to be played while they were on their way to the moon, although I think it was a Sinatra song, Fly Me to the Moon, right? That was the first song played on the moon. I don't know if any of my information is correct or not, but we have somebody on the phone who will know a little bit about going to the moon. Her name is Kelsey Young. She's a NASA scientist. And today, as you know, is the 50th anniversary of NASA's Apollo 11 launch to the moon. And we're talking about that and the first time we went to the moon, that whole thing. So, Kelsey Young, we are so fascinated by this topic, and it's such an honor to have you on our show. Good morning, Kelsey.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Oh, you're welcome. Where are you calling from?
I am calling from NASA's Goddard Space Flight Center in Greenbelt, Maryland.
Oh, Greenbelt. We got a big event happening at the Cape down here, not too far from where we're broadcasting.
Absolutely. There are events all over the country where people can go and celebrate the moon landing.
Wasn't it a good time? You don't look old enough. Robin showed me your picture. You don't remember it, do you? Or
I unfortunately was not alive during the moon landing. I've heard both my parents' stories about where they were, and I know that I'm sure a ton of your listeners have amazing stories about how the moon landing impacted their lives. Including
Robin and me. We're both old enough to remember. We were both 14 at the time.
Oh, yeah. It was a great, great moment.
Yeah, it was so exciting. And there's so many things about it that we never knew. Like this morning, somebody called in, and I never knew this. I learned it from one of our listeners, that the astronauts were told basically there's a 50-50 chance you'll get back alive. I had no idea that they went.
Yeah, there definitely was obviously a chance for risk, right? We had never done that before. Never, of course, the famous JFK words of landing a man safely on the moon and returning him safely to Earth. Of course, there are always risks in space flight, but the engineers working on the Apollo program were the best. So thankfully, we got everyone back safely.
So as a NASA scientist, do you help develop things that make it possible to travel through space?
Yeah, so I'm a geologist, and I think about what astronauts are going to be doing when we go back to the surface of the moon and when we're operating on the surface of Mars. So my sort of area is science into human spaceflight. So what kinds of rocks will we be picking up on the moon and Mars? What kind of instruments and science experiments will we be doing on the surface? And how do we plan to make that happen?
Okay, one question that has come up more than once is water. How do we get water to the moon, or is there water up there that we can use, or ice that we can melt or something?
Such an exciting question. So we've actually found we've discovered in the last few years by looking at the samples from Apollo, as well as using the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter, which has been orbiting the moon for the last 10 years, that the moon is a much wetter place than we originally thought, which is kind of a crazy thing to say and think about. But there's obviously no surface water on the moon like we're familiar with here on Earth. But there is water underneath the surface. And so, NASA's plans for the future of lunar exploration focus on that water, like you said, and perhaps turning it into a resource. How can we use the water that we find and turn it into something that humans could use to create more of a sustainable human presence on the moon?
Really? So that, like, if you could drill a well, there's actually water underneath?
It's not like flowing liquid water or reservoirs of water like we're used to seeing, which is one of the tricky challenges of thinking about how to use it. How do we get it out from under the surface and then process it into a form that is usable for human exploration? So you're touching on an incredibly active area of research at NASA right now, and it's one of the most exciting things about going back to the moon.
Do we know enough about Mars to answer that question for that planet also?
Yeah, that's a great question. So Mars is also a really exciting area of research, and we do know that Mars was once quite a wet place. We see evidences of oceans and flowing water, and that's definitely going to be a really important exploration target. It currently is right now for the Mars rovers that are exploring the red planet today, and it's certainly going to be of interest for future human exploration of Mars.
Does it tell us anything about our own planet? Like, do we know things about ourselves that we actually learned from the moon or maybe from Mars?
Oh, I love that question. So the moon is our nearest celestial neighbor, of course. And so obviously by studying the moon, it actually tells us something about what has happened to our planet. So just to give you one example, there are impact craters that just when you look up at the moon tonight, you can see impact craters all over the surface. our planet was subjected to the same amount of bombardment or, being hit by things in space that the moon was. So when you look up at the moon and you see all those pockmarks and craters, you have to think to yourself, oh my gosh, like our planet must have gone through something similar. So by characterizing when that impact history happened on the moon, it tells us something about how many things hit our planet and how much heat and water might have been added in our planet's early history.
And we're told all the time that we have meteors entering our atmosphere or small asteroids all the time, but they burn up in the atmosphere, and that's why we're not really bothered by them a whole lot, except for once in a while, I suppose. But in the moon's case, there's no atmosphere. So if we were to colonize the moon, are we doing something to protect? Like, how did the astronauts 50 years ago, how did they not get hit by something?
Yeah, this is a really important area when you consider human spaceflight, of course, and it's something that even the astronauts on the International Space Station, think about a little bit. So there are protections in place to make sure that we're monitoring the sky to make sure we don't see anything big enough to damage a spacecraft that humans are in. But you touched on a very important point. There are meteors that hit the lunar surface, all the time. Most of them are relatively small, so not of the size that we'd be really concerned about for human exploration. But you're right, when we think about establishing a long-term presence on the lunar surface, it's definitely something we need to think about. So thinking about what future habitats will look like has to account for hazards like meteor impacts.
We were told that your target landing place on the moon for the next mission is the moon's south pole. Why was that chosen?
Yes, the South Pole. So it's crazy to think about. We've landed on the moon with people 6 times, and those 6 landing sites are actually clustered pretty closely together. So think about if you've never been to North America, for example, and you had to pick a landing site. If you make that analog between the 6 lunar landing sites and exploring the North American continent, it would basically be the equivalent of visiting Minnesota or something similar. So you get the sense that you're really not capturing all of what the moon has to offer by those 6 landing sites for the Apollo. So the South Pole, first of all, is different than what we've experienced before. The rocks that we'll bring back from the South Pole will be different than the rocks we brought back from Apollo. The other exciting thing about the South Pole is water. So I mentioned the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter earlier. This is a spacecraft that NASA's been operating for the last 10 years around the moon. And with the help of this spacecraft, we've learned that there is water, as I mentioned earlier on the moon, but that the highest concentrations of that water are at the South Pole. So that's our best bet to really be able to use that water as a resource, like we mentioned earlier, and turn it into something that we can use for human exploration. So the South Pole is just an amazingly rich scientific and exploration resource for exploration. And that's why we picked it for NASA's Artemis program.
And how many people are going to be doing the landing and be actually on the moon at the same time?
Good question. We're still working out all those details. Like I mentioned, NASA's Artemis program is what we're calling the program to put the first woman and the next man on the surface of the moon. We don't know initially what that lunar landing will look like in terms of the number of astronauts that will be on that landed mission. But we do hope to establish a portfolio of missions that will eventually lead to that long-term sustainable presence on the moon with humans. So we're hopeful that, as we build toward that presence, we'll be able to cycle through quite a few astronauts to the lunar surface.
So I have 2 questions in one, if I could just ask both of them and have you comment. Does the moon have magnetic poles? And I'm asking for purposes of navigation. So the other question is, will there be like satellites circulating the moon so they can serve as a GPS for the moon?
Yeah, so GPS on the moon, that's like when thinking about for my purposes as a scientist, as a geologist, we want really precise constraints on where the rocks that the astronauts pick up were from. Like, for example, with the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter taking high-resolution images of the lunar surface, they've imaged the Apollo sites, and that high-resolution imagery has for the first time given us really high-resolution information on where those rocks were collected because, as you said, there's no GPS for the moon right now. So we do not currently have enough, satellites in orbit around the moon to give us that high-resolution GPS information. But we're looking at other ways to be able to have, precise locational tracking for astronauts on the lunar surface. And that's, a really active area. You've touched on a really exciting potential resource for future exploration.
And are the poles magnetic on the moon, or?
Yes, there is magnetism on the moon. It's hard to conceptualize how we might use that for future GPS and location tracking, but it's definitely one area that we're looking at to create that navigation assistance.
It's amazing what you guys have all been able to pull out. It's just when you think about what you were able to do and what you're still able to do, and the other things that will still soon unfold, To me, it's amazing. It really is. It's an everyday thing for you. Do you have like a new discovery at least once a month, or how often do you have the aha moment?
I would say that, I absolutely love working here. I feel very lucky to be at NASA, and it's especially an important time, I think this week, honestly, to reflect on the 50th anniversary while also, looking to the future and looking forward. But in terms of aha moments, I'm a field geologist. I, get out and get my hands dirty and go to sites on Earth that look like sites we see on other planets to learn about surface processes, on Earth that have also shaped the Moon and Mars. So a lot of my aha moments come from, standing on a volcano on Earth that looks like, pictures of volcanoes I've seen on the Moon and Mars, and saying, oh, like I absolutely understand how that landscape was formed because I'm standing on that landscape on Earth. So I'm lucky enough to get lots of aha moments, and I absolutely love working here.
When you were talking about the reflections, we learned that NASA that there is an audio series called NASA Explorers Apollo, and that you're inviting the public to submit their memories of the Apollo 11 moon mission.
Yes, and I was going to ask the two of you if you wouldn't mind doing this, because it sounds like you both have vivid memories of the landing. So if you guys go to nasa.gov/Apollo stories, you can actually record your memories, your impressions of the moon landing. And I encourage you and all of your listeners to do so. So you can share where you were during the landing, and if like me, you weren't alive, you can record your parents, grandparents, friends, neighbors' experiences, or just how that moon landing impacted and touched your life. And through doing that, you can actually connect with other people who had similar experiences and hear from people all over the world. So nasa.gov/Apollo stories, and I hope you guys all check it out.
So let me share one with you. This is not exactly about the exact time of the lunar landing, but this is like a short time later, when the whole country, the whole world probably was really infatuated with this whole new thing that we were experiencing. And I had a Super 8mm camera as a kid. And so my family took a trip down to Florida. I lived in New York at the time. Now I live here. But we went to the Space Center, and I took these 8mm movies, and I had a project in my science class back in New York. I can't remember what grade it was, probably junior high school, whatever grades those are, 7, 8, 9, one of those grades. And I thought, well, this is my project. I'm just going to show this movie. And it was a silent movie, and all it really showed was like the Space Center, like the rockets, and it showed my brother making faces at the camera, and I'm thinking, oh boy, I'm not going to get a good grade on this. But I got an A. I got an A because everybody was so excited to see. Like I went someplace cool, I guess, from their perspective, and so that was.
Do you still have it?
Oh, I wish. No.
Oh my.
No, I don't. But I can see it in my mind. Does that matter?
That would be quite a time capsule. I'm always reflect when I see, photos and videos, of course, of the launch. It's very emotional to me to watch that launch. But equally as interesting is the shots of the audience and the crowds when they're watching the launch, because just the sheer delight and wonder, as well as just, it's a time capsule, what people were wearing, how they were, grouped in families and friend groups. And it's just a pleasure to watch every new piece of footage I find about the launch.
One of the sacrifices was I think it was Apollo 1, where the oxygen burned the astronauts to death.
Yep.
Can you tell us how that changed the way we thought about giving air to breathe for the astronauts?
Yeah, so for those not familiar, there was an accident on the launch pad with the Apollo 1 mission, and we lost all 3 crew for the Apollo 1 mission, which is just, still, of course, one of the greatest tragedies in human spaceflight. And, of course, it taught us a lot, right? We redesigned the capsule after that accident, and there was a multi-year investigation, of course, into what ended up causing the fire. And, of course, as with most things, it ended up being a couple different factors that led to that fatal accident. But to your point, absolutely. We learned so much about capsule design and just about how to run the specific type of test that they were doing in advance of the launch of the mission, which led to the event that led to the tragedy. So we certainly learned a lot about spaceflight, even just from the accident that occurred just on the launch pad.
Well, you talked about the moon rock samples earlier, and we understand that there are some that still haven't been opened yet and examined.
Yes. Oh my gosh, this is amazing. So the folks on the Apollo project actually had the foresight to save some of the samples that the Apollo astronauts, brought back from the moon, and they didn't open them because they knew that technology would be advancing so quickly in the decades after Apollo that it would benefit, from saving some of those rocks to get fresh eyes on them with these new technologies. And of course, that's exactly what happened. Technology has come quite a long way since then, and so NASA recently decided to open just a few of these previously unopened samples. And actually right here at NASA's Goddard Space Flight Center, where I am, we have two different teams that will be looking at these previously unopened rocks. So there are teams, across the country doing this, and we have two right here at Goddard. And it's enabled us to look at these rocks that have been sitting on the Earth for 50 years, but with a whole new perspective. And it's going to enable some really exciting science. That'll be happening in the next few months.
That is cool. Can you explain something to me? Once in a while, there'll be a story on the news about a meteor that is from the moon. First of all, how does that happen, that a rock leaves the moon and comes to Earth? And second of all, how do we know? I mean, how do we know where it came from?
Yeah, that's really important to think about. So first of all, as I mentioned, there are craters all over the lunar surface. Some are small, some are big, some are really, really big. And so when the moon gets impacted by something else, it obviously throws out a lot of material. When a meteor impacts the surface of the moon, a lot of ejecta gets thrown up into space. And if that ejecta, that material, gets blasted off fast enough, it can actually escape lunar orbit and get kicked into space. And so that material can float around in space for quite a long time, billions of years, or it can get sucked into the Earth's orbit and land on Earth, as a meteorite here on Earth. So we have teams that find meteorites on Earth all the time. We can see fresh falls, and we can also find meteorites that landed long ago. And through compositional analysis, we can actually match some of those meteorites in composition to both the Apollo samples that we have that we know are from the moon, as well as some of the remotely sensed data we have from orbiters around the lunar surface. So by actually examining what these meteorites are made out of and how they look, we can start to get at where they're from. And like you said, we've actually found that some of them are from the moon. We actually think we have a couple from Mars too. So we just have to get lucky with the ejecta that flew off the moon and then landed on Earth, and then we got lucky enough to find it.
That is cool to know.
And how is the living conditions going to be up there? Are you going to have one capsule land and then you're going to have like an extension for the astronauts to be in while they're there that'll make it larger, or is that not figured out yet?
We're still working all the details of the Artemis program, which is, of course, the program to send humans to the moon. So we are still working the details of, how many capsules there'll be when and what the size of the lander will be. And, we're working on those details actively right now. But, we will put people in space, we'll put people in orbit around the moon, and we'll put people on boots on the ground on the moon. And so details are still in work, but it's going to happen in the next few years.
And has there been any advances with the spacesuit itself?
Right. So the spacesuit that we currently have in operation, all the time today is on the International Space Station. So the suit that, that you see pictures of and selfies of astronauts doing EVAs or spacewalks outside of the International Space Station is built for the space station. It's built for spacewalks outside of the space station. So we're exploring right now options for spacesuits to explore the lunar surface. And that's a really, active area of research right now. And it's obviously an important one when we're considering doing spacewalks on the moon. But yeah, the suit and, so what that lander is going to look like are two of the most active areas at NASA right now.
Are we getting to a point where we won't have to have the vertical liftoff? Can we take off like an airplane does and then end up on the moon somehow, or is that impossible?
Ooh, you're thinking like an engineer. That's for you. Unclear. We don't have that, that technology plan in place quite yet. And like I said, it's an active area of research. But that's exactly what we're doing in NASA, is trying to think creatively. And I love the suggestion. And it's that kind of creative thinking that I think drove the space shuttle, drove International Space Station, and what I think is going to drive lunar exploration.
Because I'm thinking about myself going, and if I can take a plane, I can handle that, but sitting on top of a big stick that goes straight up, I don't know.
Yeah, you hear the Apollo astronauts' descriptions of sitting on, like the biggest rocket ever, the Saturn V, and I mean, half of me is like, oh, I can't, like I would die to do that, and the other half of me is like, whoa, that's pretty intimidating. So we'll see.
What is the time frame when you do lift off from the launch pad? What is your window of opportunity, and what do you look for during that window to be safe?
Yeah, for the window of opportunity, there are a lot of things you look for. Weather, frankly, is a big one. You don't want to launch right into a storm, of course. Wind conditions, weather conditions. If there's lightning in the area, that's a no-go. The space shuttle launches, they looked for, boats in the water off the coast of Kennedy Space Center. And you also, when you think about destinations farther from Earth, there are launch windows that have to do with orbital mechanics and how the planets are moving opposite one another. So you want to plan both the safest and the fastest flight path, especially when you have humans, to get to a destination beyond low Earth orbit. So when we consider the moon as a destination, it's only a few days away, right? You mentioned earlier that it only took a few days for the astronauts to get to the moon. For Mars, it's a few months. And so the launch window becomes a much more, tightly constrained, where you have just a few days to hit your launch window. So it depends on, conditions on the ground on Earth, but also conditions in the solar system.
Wow, that's so fascinating. So this is more of a not political question, but not so scientific. But does the advent of the SpaceX, the private companies, is that a competitor to NASA, or is it a collaborative thing with NASA? How does that relationship work?
Yeah, definitely a collaborative environment. I mean, it's really, the future of NASA and human spaceflight, really is integrally linked to our commercial and our international partners as well. The International Space Station is the International Space Station, right? So we count on our international partners. But now, moving forward, like you said, commercial partners are a big part of NASA's future. It's a big part of how we're going to, continue to operate in low Earth orbit, but also move farther into outer space destinations. So long story short, it's absolutely a partnership.
So we'd have to make a lot more money at this radio station to be a partner, really.
Yeah, I think so.
I don't know. You keep bringing these creative ideas, and we can talk.
So you have the Goddard Space Center in Maryland. You have the Johnson Space Center in Houston, and then the Kennedy Space Center here in Florida. How do you connect everything so everybody knows what's going on at the same time?
So there are those three. So Goddard, Kennedy, Johnson. There are also other NASA centers all around the country. So the setup is quite broad. It's all over the country, and we have scientists, engineers, astronauts, spaceflight professionals, HR, business, artists that work all across all these NASA centers. And it's definitely one NASA family trying to put boots on the ground on the moon again. So it's definitely a team effort. Of course, the launches generally happen. A lot of them happen from the Kennedy Space Center. Johnson Space Center has the astronaut office where the astronauts live and work. So each center, has their own special brand of what they'll contribute to the moon landing. But it's definitely a team effort, and certainly it's not the case that one center could do it all by themselves.
Well, they're sure lucky to have you. You are so exciting.
Oh my gosh. and we are lucky to have you on the air with us today, especially the 50th anniversary of the launching of the rocket that actually made it to the moon. I can remember as a kid, again, going to the Kennedy Space Center and seeing the capsule. In fact, we had a replica capsule here in Ocala.
Yes, we did.
We might still have one.
At the Discovery Science Center.
And when you think about how big the Saturn V was and how small the last piece, the one that actually came back, it's amazing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and there are capsules and replicas like that all over the country, and I really encourage you, and I know they're being highlighted this week, of course, for the anniversary. So if you actually go to nasa.gov, you can find events near you, and that they should highlight what you just said. So exactly where you can go to see old spacesuits and the Saturn V rockets and the capsules, and it's a great way to look back. And for the capsule example, can you imagine sitting in that capsule for 3 days with two of your closest friends?
No,
Wow.
I'm having a hard time with that. I don't even want to go in a motorhome with three of my friends. Kelsey, you are a great guest. That was such a great interview. Thank you so much for being on the air with us today. I will do, and I encourage everybody else to do what Kelsey suggested, is that we go to nasa.gov/Apollo stories and record what you remember from 50 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Thanks so much for having me. This was a lot of fun.
Kelsey, unbelievable. That was so good. Thank you again.
Thank you.
All right, and we'll be right back.
Broadcasting from the Paddock Mall Studios, this is WOCA, Ocala, Gainesville, The Villages, 1370 AM, 96.3 FM, The Source.
Fox News, I'm Lillian Wu. President Trump insisting he doesn't have a racist bone in his body. This as the congresswomen he's told to go back to their country bash his tweets, and the House gets ready to vote on a resolution condemning some of his remarks.
Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib called for an impeachment inquiry.
This is not the first nor